I wonder if I did a 5-minute satsang, whether it would be any less valuable than a 2-hour satsang. In a way, it would be possibly more valuable, because I'd talk for 5 minutes and then say, that's it. And you'd be left going, wow, just 5 minutes? And that's it? That must mean that what was said in the 5 minutes was important. If I talk for another 25 minutes after the first 5 minutes that included something important, the probability is that what was important and what was said in the first 5 minutes sort of gets left behind when we go on to the next topic and the next topic and the next topic. So do we think today is going to be a 5-minute satsang? It's not going to be a 5-minute satsang, but let me put into the first few minutes something that if we stopped would be more than enough. Firstly, the potential is there for human beings to live in life free of suffering, to wake up in the morning, to go about your day not knowing what your day is going to unfold like, dealing with whatever the circumstance is, and finding yourself at peace, which really means without the uncomfortableness of suffering arising. That is something available for everyone listening to this talk. In simple terms, it means happiness for the human being in this life is available for you. And happiness specifically means continuous, unbroken peace of mind as you go about your daily life doing whatever it is that you have to do. Work, dealing with children, dealing with your friends, or just food or a movie or a combination of all of those things. That's what spiritual teachers and teachings have been telling us for thousands of years. Happiness for the human being in the form of unbroken peace of mind, the end of suffering, is available. It's not our experience of life when life has designed us, has created us as an instrument that experiences life in such a way that a resistance to life in various forms, guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation happens. And it becomes our experience of life when life itself, the movement of life, as we move through the course of life, we are changed biologically and psychologically, primarily psychologically, in such a way that we come to know ourselves more fully. And in knowing ourselves more fully, we find that that part of the human being that was always resisting, mentally judging and resisting and imagining life to be different or wanting it to be different, falls away. It happens when life changes us such that that aspect falls away. So really, what I'm suggesting is that we're always the human being, we're always the person, designed a particular way and we will suffer, designed differently, as in changed, so our design changes, and the person continues to exist but experiences a different way of being in life. So that's available. What is this change all about? How does it happen? It happens because life does it to us. But in more specific terms, by and large, the change is a result of thinking that undoes previously ingrained structures of belief. So if I was about to end the satsang now, I'd like to insert one more very important piece of information for us to think about between now and tomorrow's satsang. And that is that the flow of life, meaning your circumstance in each moment. So when I say the flow of life, you might as well think of it from the moment you wake up today to the time when you go to sleep today. So it doesn't have to be the flow of your life for 20 or 30 years. That might be too much to chew. But the flow of life in the day, from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, is always going to be either pleasure or pain, a mix of pleasure or pain, or a mix of pleasure and pain. That is the extent of the flow of life. So it can be, we can reduce the complexity of the flow of life down to two generic descriptors: pleasure or pain. Sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. It will be pleasurable if the circumstance is in line with our biological preferences. If we have a nice cup of tea, the tea is pleasurable if it's in line with our preferences. If the tea is too bitter and that is not how we like it, then we could say it is painful. If the temperature is just right, in line with our preferences, it's pleasurable. If the temperature outside is too hot or too cold and we have to work outside, then if it's not in line with our preferences, it's painful. If you're in a hotel room and the people in the room next to you are partying and making loud noise till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and you can't sleep, and that you could say is not in line with your preferences, then that's pain. If the hotel comes and offers you a free voucher to a spa session, that's pleasure. Receiving it is, oh, wow, this is good. This is nice, assuming it's in line with your preferences. And there is pleasure for just being given the voucher. If you really dislike going to spas and you get a voucher, you might say, oh, I wish it was something different. And so then you could say it's not in line with your preference, so it's painful. It might be pleasurable receiving the voucher. You might go to the spa and have a very unpleasant massage, not in line with your preferences. And then you can say, well, that was a waste of time. It was painful. If you break your favorite cup on the ground, that experience is painful. If your child gets in trouble at school and you find out about it, it's not in line with your biological preferences, so it's painful. If you lose a big customer, not in line with your preferences, painful. If you win a new account at work and that is something you like happening, then it's pleasurable. If someone shouts at you and you don't like being shouted at, it doesn't feel good to be shouted at, that's painful. So the circumstance, whatever it is, if you break your leg, if a friend dies, if you get told you are going to die, all of that is circumstance. And that's what life is, circumstance. And circumstance is made up of outcomes. So circumstance, outcomes, flow of life, all interchangeable words. And the flow of life, circumstance, outcomes is either pleasure or pain. So whenever something happens, the thought can arise, this is just pleasure or pain. This is either pleasure or pain. And you can have fun identifying whether it's pleasure or pain. Not when it happens, you don't need to be theoretical. You can go to your biological preference and see if that is something that is in line with your preference or not in line with your preference. If you come to watch Satsang and the internet connection is no good, then you go, that's not my preference, so it's painful. The flow of life is either pleasure or pain. We can categorize it into pleasure or pain, or physical, sorry, not biological. I'll start again. We can categorize it into three categories. Physical pleasure or pain, stubbing your toe or having a nice cup of tea. Financial pleasure or pain, winning a lottery, or finding that someone has stolen your wallet. Two examples, one pleasure, financial pleasure, and the other financial pain. And emotional pleasure or pain. Someone that you're very close to is ill or dies. That's not your preference. So you're not, when you hear the news, it makes sense. It's going to be a form of pain, not your preference. And in a situation like that, we would call it emotional pain. If you get angry, that's emotional pain. If you're excited about seeing someone you haven't seen for a long time, that's emotional pleasure. So all of life's circumstance is either pleasure or pain. And if you start registering, oh, this is pain in the moment, this is pleasure in the moment, this is pain in the moment, this is more pain in the moment, oh, this is pleasure in the moment, this is pleasure in the moment, this is pleasure in the moment. And you find that happening throughout the day, it means you're becoming more familiar with the fact that the flow of life is either pleasure or pain. You go to book an airline ticket and the ticket price has dropped from what it was showing you yesterday, and you were about to book it yesterday and you book it today and it's $200 cheaper. Financial pleasure in the moment. It means that your understanding about the flow of life being either pleasure or pain is going deeper. It's not just a concept you've heard. You're starting to see the pleasure and pain as it presents, as life unfolds, hour after hour after hour, minute after minute after minute, from the time you wake up. It's the pleasure and pain of life unfolding. Why is this significant? It's significant because our happiness is never to be found in the flow of life. What is the flow of life? The flow of life is circumstance. The flow of life is outcomes. The flow of life is either pleasure or pain. My happiness is never to be found in the flow of life. That means my happiness is never to be determined by the circumstance of life. It's saying that if life is painful, that does not mean that you have to be unhappy. And it's saying if life is pleasurable, that is not what is going to make you happy. So it's essentially saying your happiness is not dependent on life being pleasure, 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 pleasure. Why is this important? Because we have developed as human beings in such a way that a deeply ingrained belief has set in. And the deeply ingrained belief, even if we don't repeat it in a conscious way, says on the level of self, the level of the small self, it's the deeply ingrained belief has become our self-identity, what I refer to as a psychological identity that is being locked in place by our development over the years in life. And that belief says my happiness is to my happiness is to be found in life being pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So the concept that I'm putting forward as the concept which I suggest is an accurate concept in relation to one's happiness says your happiness is not to be found in pleasure and pain. So don't look for it in pleasure or pain. Don't look for it in craving pleasure and resisting pain. So that concept that says your happiness isn't to be found in pleasure or pain isn't very powerful if we don't first understand what pleasure and pain is and where it's to be found. And so that's why I was spending so much time on saying that the flow of life, the circumstance you find yourself in each moment, that's the flow of life, is either pleasure or pain. Then the concept is your happiness isn't dependent, isn't determined by whether life is pleasure or painful. So it means your happiness is available regardless of circumstance, regardless of whether life is pleasurable or painful. And yet we have a deeply ingrained belief that says the contrary. The deeply ingrained belief says my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And so that means we have an attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcomes towards the flow of life. The flow of life is only ever pleasure or pain. Our attitude to the flow of life, however, is where the layer of suffering exists. And when we have an attitude of attachment to pleasure and aversion to pain, the attitude makes the suffering and the pleasure or pain seem like one thing. And when the pleasure or pain is intertwined with the attitude and it becomes essentially like one thing, it reinforces the deeply ingrained belief that says my happiness is dependent on pleasure and pain. Because we find that our unhappiness is directly correlated with the pleasure or pain because of this attachment to pleasure and pain. And the attachment, which is an attitude towards pleasure or pain, a way of relating to pleasure or pain, is there because of this deeply ingrained belief, which is the false sense of who we are. So our unhappiness is always attitudinal. Attitudinal to what? Attitudinal to circumstance. What does attitudinal to circumstance mean? It means the way we relate to circumstance, the investment we have in circumstance. And when this belief is in place, the investment we have is saying, my very existence, my happiness, my completeness is dependent on circumstance. So we become completely identified and invested in circumstance being a particular way. And the particular way that we want it to be is pleasure, 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 according to the image we have of what will make us happy. And all of that thinking is completely misguided. So I say all this because hopefully in the following days, you will find yourself in circumstance in life. You will find circumstance being painful at times, where there are things happening that you are not in line with your preferences. And then you might notice the attitude towards the circumstance being one of involvement, being one of resistance, where there is an uncomfortableness with oneself and uncomfortableness with the other because of the way that the circumstance unfolded. And in that moment, a thought might arise, which is reminding you that your sense of self, your real sense of self, your existence, your completeness, who you are, is not defined by circumstance. And then yet we might see that our attitude is so involved in it that it's saying, this is so important. This circumstance is so important. And that's when we'll realize, oh, that's my attitude that is attached to circumstance, attached to outcomes. And so the thought, my happiness is not to be found in the flow of life, can essentially allow us to withdraw our investment in circumstance. So withdraw our psychological involvement and come back to what we can call presence or being, where we say, who cares? Your friend has stolen some money from you, right? And so there is going to be emotional pain. Like if you find out, wow, my friend stole money from me. Who would have thought? Right? Emotional pain. If emotional pain is different to the suffering. Emotional pain is, I don't want to find out that my friend has stolen money. That's not something that's in line with my preference. Not necessarily because of the loss of money, that's financial pain, but more so probably because it says something about the friendship. So we can have financial pain and emotional pain. If, however, there is an attitude towards that circumstance that is becoming highly invested in it, highly involved in it, where we blame the friend, where we feel resistance to the circumstance being like that. Not the biological resistance, which is what we could call vertical, but the horizontal psychological involvement that regurgitates what has happened over and over and over for hours and for days and for weeks and for months, blaming the other, feeling like the situation should be different. If we see that, the thought might arise, maybe after 5 minutes, maybe after 5 days, when it's realized, my happiness isn't to be found in circumstance. My happiness really means my sense of who I am is not located in circumstance. So let me not lose myself by becoming completely involved in circumstance. And it might cut off the narrative that we have going. And if we find the narrative just wants to keep going, then it's not our job to forcibly cut the narrative off. We're not even the ones that cut the narrative off when it gets cut off. When it gets cut off, there is just a thought arising that is arising from makeup at that point in time. So if this teaching has become part of your up-to-date conditioning, the thought might arise automatically. When the suffering, the involvement in the situation is seen, the thought that reminds us your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. And it might create a cutoff for 3 seconds. Now that's because the thought arose. You didn't make the thought arise. It arises at some point. And it might cut the suffering off. And then after 3 seconds, we sort of go, but actually, it's not acceptable. And we go back into it. And then the thought might arise, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, in pleasure or pain, in circumstance. And yet it doesn't cut off the suffering. It's like, no, I don't believe that. This is very important. I don't know why he would do that. And so that's the suffering. And if it persists, all it means is that the belief in doership and the belief in attachment to outcomes in that moment is in the system in such a way that it is forced to express, is forced to arise as suffering. And if we understand that that is a result of our makeup and we can't change our makeup, then we can witness the involvement happening. And the witnessing of the involvement will only happen if our system has been equipped with certain intellectual ideas that become part of our makeup. And the intellectual idea, the concept that might allow the suffering to be witnessed is when we deeply realize, I didn't put this belief in personal doership and this belief in attachment to outcome in place. I'm not in charge of when it gets dissolved. So if it's there at 9 a.m. on the 23rd of May, 2020, and the situation happens, there is going to be suffering. If it's there in sufficient quantity for suffering to arise. And then if we see the thought that reminds us, my happiness is not to be found in outcomes, and it cuts off the suffering for 3 seconds, it means that's because our system was equipped in such a way that the suffering happened, then the thought arose and it cut off the suffering. And then we find ourselves getting dragged back into the suffering. The reminder thought might arise again, but it might have no effect. And then we might realize, okay, it's not having an effect because the belief in this moment is in place in such a way that forces the suffering to be there. And so our understanding will say, there's nothing for me to do. This is life unfolding. And the suffering, the thought that says, I simply can't believe that a friend of 20 years has done this to me. I really don't want to talk to them ever again. Could be the thinking. And silent witnessing awareness is aware of the thinking that's happening. It's not saying that's no good, you shouldn't be thinking that. It's just witnessing it. Understanding that it's not personal. It's a happening. Even though the thinking is thinking that says this is extremely personal, the understanding that knows that thinking is coming out of deeply ingrained beliefs that life has put in place will look at the thinking that's taking it very personally and know that is just a happening, nothing to do about it. Now, that witnessing won't happen if the system isn't equipped a certain way. And these talks are just equipping the system. Maybe. We don't know how the words are going to land. It's not up to you to equip the system. It's not up to me to equip the system. I turn up, you turn up. There's an interchange, and we see what happens.